Hey guys, it's Gary. I'm having a little bit of a throat thing going on. I just ate crackers a while ago, and it's just like something's happening in my throat. I don't know, they just don't want to let go and go down to my stomach. Um, been away for a while. I just did a whole 5 minute diatribe here and realized it wasn't recording, which maybe means maybe I shouldn't be recording videos after 10 o'clock at night. I don't know. I've been away for a while. I'm a big fan of Halloween, as you guys I'm sure know. Um, and instead of doing videos, I've been putting up obviously a lot of audiobooks, Halloween ghost story themed things. So thank you for indulging me with those. I love those things, and those particular ones I put up I've had now for 10 or 11 years, and they get played every year. But yeah, it's a little bit of a downer for me when Halloween's over. I like to continue the holiday. And Woody is back there somewhere. I forgot to grab him before I started recording. I still have Brainy out, but he's not making an appearance now because he's actually in pieces in my bathroom, of all places. But that's what you get when you live in a smaller place. Um, he's not away yet, though. I'm not quite ready to let go of Halloween yet. Though the weather kind of started going into the upper 60s and 70s. It's doesn't feel like Halloween time or autumn, which is my favorite time of year. So I know I'm kind of overdue to do a video. I didn't have so many Halloween themed things, and I don't have a lot prepared. I think what I'm going to do is my next few videos are probably going to be taking a note from Carm, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing he's around to do videos. Otherwise, I think I'd run out of stuff very quickly. Um, being unemployed, I'm not quite spending as much money on CDs as I used to and albums, and it's forced me to go back, and I've been going through some of my archives, for lack of a better term. I have a lot of things that still are in bins around my place here that aren't in any kind of logical order, and I do have some artists that I have put into logical order, but a lot that I haven't. And this week I pulled out a bunch of CDs that I still have to listen to before I do kind of a review of them. I pulled out a bunch of CDs that I bought years ago that didn't get much play, so I'm kind of revisiting them. And what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to, like I said, take a page from Carm and just to kind of grab a stack of those things, give them a listen. I put them in my computer. They weren't in my computer, which means I haven't listened to them for probably 10 years or more. And they probably didn't get more than 1 or 2 plays back then. And maybe do a review on them. Some pretty obscure things. Maybe I'll do a kind of a visit of them. I would say revisit. I probably only played them a couple times. Anyway, what I decided to do today, it's kind of late, and I'm going to have to be a little quieter living in a condo. Though I know above me is my neighbor's kitchen, and they kind of keep odd hours. It's funny because in the early evening hours, a lot of times they're home or they're not home. And even if they're home, it's really quiet, like 7, 8, 9 o'clock. All of a sudden, a lot of times at midnight, you start hearing stuff going on in the kitchen. And they're violently food processing stuff or chopping things or jumping up and down doing jumping jacks while they're doing their food processes. It's a weird thing. They got weird hours. And that's coming from me, who has even weirder hours. I'm not quite sure what to call this series when I'm going back. I could say they're iconic albums, but it's more maybe like favorite albums. But it's more like got a handful of albums that I really like by artists that I have a lot of recordings by, and oftentimes I'll have a very unusual favorite album by them, or maybe not even an album I would consider my favorite, but maybe for whatever reasons, one that gets played more than others. And there are albums often that other people don't like from that artist. So with that in mind, I thought I would do a shorter video today. And it's not an overview on Harold Budd. It's going to be more like my favorite. At some point I'll do a whole big long Harold Budd thing. And he's playing in the background, but I can't put it too loud, and I don't know how much you'll be able to hear it. I'm going to try to remember to link a playlist. Of course, I'm getting senile. I don't know if I will remember. I'm going to try to link a playlist of the main album that I'm talking about by Harold Budd. So you guys can listen for yourself, because you probably don't have it. Not that it's rare or anything, but it's one of the lesser known ones by Harold Budd. But I'll get to that right away. How did I get into Harold Budd? I'm not doing a whole overview, but basically I got into Harold Budd from Brian Eno, Discrete music, which I still think is the single best Brian Eno album of ambient music. Even though he didn't call it ambient music yet at this point. I actually have 2 vinyl versions of this. This is a later one. And the back of it shows you the process, because digital delay units didn't really exist. And so basically, hooked up 2 reel-to-reel tape recorders to create a delay and play over that. And this is the diagram of how he set that up. A story explaining how he did it. Fantastic album. The best ambient music I've ever heard, probably, certainly from him. Because at least the 30-minute piece, there's an interesting experiment with an orchestra on the second side where they take Pachelbel's canon and they cut it up into pieces. And each instrumentalist, it's played by a regular string orchestra, and each instrumentalist plays a different part of it, but plays that part as long as they want. So it's not the traditional Pachelbel's canon as you're used to hearing. Creates a really pretty piece. The main thrust of the album, though, is the piece called Discrete Music, which is a 30-minute piece, very long for a vinyl side. And it's just 2 single melody lines overlaid over each other. And they repeat, and that's it. But it's really beautiful. And Eno said he wanted to make music that was as ignorable as it was listenable. And when you listen to it, you do find yourself fading in and out of it. Even if there's nothing going on, there's something about it's very pretty. To me, it sounds like maybe the sun setting in the evening, or maybe just before the sun comes up in the morning. Beautiful piece of music. Doesn't change. No dynamics to it, really. But there's subtle changes because Eno changes the EQ. And by changing the EQ, a couple different notes, different parts of the melody get highlighted for however long he has that EQ setting. So for a couple minutes, you'll hear a couple higher notes seem like they're being mixed louder. And then those will fade away, and another couple notes do the same thing later on. Beautiful piece. And I bought this a few years after it came out. But I bought it before he did any other ambient music albums. So this was the only one that he had out at the time that I bought it. I want to say... Well, this came out, I think, 75. I want to say 75. Nah, it was recorded in late 75, so it would have come out in 76. Probably first got it 79, maybe. I got it, I liked it, but at that time he didn't have any other albums like it out. He only had his solo albums were vocal albums, more pop song oriented things. But it wasn't long after I acquired Discrete Music, less than a year, I think, that 78, 79, he started his ambient. He changed the name from Discrete Music, because that's originally how he referred to it and came out with Ambient 1 Music for Airports, which is a very famous album of his. I bought this as a new release, so it was really his second ambient music album. Good album. I don't think it's good as Discrete music. It's four separate pieces, so they don't go on as long as Discrete music. So there's one that's 16 and a half minutes. That's a long one, but there's and that's pretty long. But there's a 6-minute piece, 8-minute piece, 11-minute piece. The shorter pieces aren't there long enough for you to kind of get lost in, if that's the idea of the music. Especially a 6-minute piece kind of comes and goes fairly quickly. But the pieces are real good. It's a real good album. I remember buying this. I actually heard, you got to remember this is before the internet and everything, so you pretty much, the only way you were aware records were coming out is if like a record company was hyping it, which they wouldn't be hyping this, they'd be hyping the next whoever Rolling Stones album or something at the time, or you would go to the record store and you would see it in the racks. You generally didn't know they were coming out until they were released. But I tuned into a college station at night, late at night, and they played this. They played anything and everything, and they played something from Music for Airports. Went to the store pretty much the next day, I guess. It has a 78 date on it. I want to say that I think it came out a little bit later, maybe early 79. It could have come out 78. But it was a new release. I bought it for $4.49. It was actually the first time I went to this chain that we had here in New Jersey called Disco Mat. It was a new chain at the time. Oddly enough, I don't think it, and that came out only the very late, maybe 79 or 80. They didn't even make it to the CD era, oddly enough. And the place was packed because they had good prices. So a couple years later, about 1980, followed up with Ambient 2. And this was a collaboration with a guy named Harold Budd that I knew nothing about. There's a lot of short pieces on this album. This isn't really, as a whole, you could drift to the music, but the pieces are so short, you don't really get lost in them. No price on that one. I thought those were price stickers, but they're not. But again, because I was always going to the record store, so I caught this one as soon as it came out. It was my introduction to Harold Budd. I knew nothing about him. And at the time, he had an early album come out on a classical label, and went out of print very quickly, and that was in the very, very early 70s or so. I didn't even learn about that album until just a few years ago, actually, because he doesn't even refer to it himself. Oak of the Golden Dreams, I think it's called. I have it on CD. It finally got reissued on CD, but only in recent years. Very different from his other work. Very much like a Terry Riley trance piece with very fast keyboard, repetitive work. Not at all like the Harold Budd that you know. But this is a good album. A lot of short pieces on this, though. And not so much like Discrete music where you get lost in it. Like I said, you get lost in the album as a whole. But every few minutes it changes. There's about 5 pieces aside here. So it goes to show you, it's only 40-something minutes. So there's some very short pieces in here. Very pretty. And it seems like on this album, Harold is playing only pianos, electric and acoustic pianos, and Eno is doing some very subtle electronics in the background, sometimes just toying with the sound of Harold Budd's pianos. A lot of people know this album. But I really, I liked it. I liked the series, and there weren't a lot of them. So I decided to take the plunge because the only thing out at the time by Harold Budd was this. He always refers to this as his first album, but it really isn't. His second album, that Oak of the Golden Dreams, is actually his first album, but that came and went very, very fast. And I remember buying this. I had a friend, a good friend of mine from New Jersey. he had moved to Maryland for a couple years with his wife, and he was living in Maryland, and I was taking trips out on a lot of weekends. It was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived, and I would drive there in the middle of the night. I would leave like 2, 3 in the morning, so I had no traffic, and I could plow right along, get to Maryland in about 4 hours. And even though I'd seen this album in local stores, we were both record buying nuts. So when I would get together with him at Maryland, we'd also, hey, let's go find some record stores where he had moved to. And I bought this, I remember, in a record store in Maryland. And I didn't want to, for whatever reason, I didn't want to play it on his stereo. So it's one of the few albums that I bought that I couldn't listen to immediately. I had to wait until, 2 days, and I drove back home to New Jersey with this LP sitting in my passenger seat, just staring at it, wondering what it sounded like. I was a little concerned because it looked like it might be religious, because the translated title for one of the pieces is, it's an Arabic title, but it says, in the name of God, the beneficial, the merciful. And it almost was enough, because I'm not a religious person at all, to make me put down the album and uh-oh, it was going to be like a religious thing, and I'm glad I didn't put it back. But I thought it could, because there's a piece on here called Two Songs, and again, one of them is called Let Us Go Into the House of the Lord. And it's like, oh, gee, I don't know. But he also makes reference to Pharoah Sanders on here, John Coltrane, Marion Brown, who plays on here. It's oddly enough the first time I ever heard Marion Brown, the saxophonist. And Gavin Bryars plays on it a little bit, who's an associate of Brian Eno, so I knew him from there. And the instruments, the thing that made me not put it back, because I was a little afraid that it was a religious album. And it's weird, because after this, I don't recall seeing any religious connotations in any of Harold Budd's other albums, even by titles or anything. But the instrumentation really made me pick it back up. It's actually an all-acoustic album. There's no electric instruments on here, with the exception of 2 tracks have Harold Budd playing electric piano. And it's a nice setting to have an electric piano in with all these other acoustic instruments. Harp, celesta, glockenspiel, a whole bunch of marimbas, alto saxophone, some percussion, voices, and nothing electronic except for this electric piano on a couple pieces. But one of the longer pieces has electric piano, Marion Brown, and alto saxophone, and 4 marimba players that had already been introduced to Steve Reich. So I was into the whole idea of having a lot of marimbas. I highly recommend this album, and this isn't even the reason why I'm doing this video. But I really dug this, and I knew I had discovered a new favorite composer. And I don't think this is formative at all. And at the time, Bud had been practicing music, just not really recording albums. He had been writing music. So he was already a full-fledged composer. This isn't like an early album where he was finding his voice. And these pieces were not just written for this album. They were written in 1972, 73, 74, and 75. And this stuff wasn't recorded until late 76. So he had a much larger catalog, I understand, of works already established that, to go through, that he chose for this album. So this kind of wasn't just something brought to the table to fill an album. I think he had a lot of works to select from, and he kind of chose probably some of his personal favorites or whatever. But this is like the voice of a fully formed composer. A couple times I've read people say, review the album and thought that it sounded like an early album where he was finding his voice, but not at all, I don't think. If this album had come out now, after his many, many, many years of recording, it would sound in place. It would sound like, yeah, that's not a step backwards, that's for sure. Very composed album. He's done a few of these. He did an album with a group called Nexus, which is a modern, I think it's a quartet that play like modern classical music, and he wrote specifically for them. Some of his albums follow a more classical type of a flow to the music, not just electric keyboards. Oh, the music stopped. Hold on a second. Hold on. I'm going to try to get it to go again. Is it going? Yes, it's going. Great album. Great album. And it covers a lot of ground. First time I ever heard Marion Brown. Marion Brown plays beautifully on this. No percussion. Really, there's some percussion listed on here, but there's no drums, not that type of percussion. There are marimbas. And, I don't know what percussion they're talking about because I really don't hear any drum type sounds on here. Beautiful, beautiful album. Highly recommended. So after getting that and hearing Bud on the Eno album, I was a full-fledged fan. Pavilion of Dreams is still one of my favorite albums by him. So I had another artist that just I was going to blindly buy and pick up anything I could get. There's a period then after that though, after the Ambient 2 album that he made with Eno, a couple of years nothing of his came out. And I kept looking, and I thought it was strange because it seemed like with the Pavilion of Dreams, that was actually recorded and released before the Ambient 2 album. But I didn't know of the album's existence, and I only learned about it in retrospect after hearing Ambient 2 with Brian Eno, and then went back and bought the Pavilion of Dreams album. Pretty much nothing from Harold Budd for a couple of years. And then we get to about 84 when things started all of a sudden coming out. So I think there's problems with record labels. I don't think Bud was, Eno changed labels, and the Pavilion of Dreams came out on Eno's label, so, and so did the Pavilion of Dreams came out on EG Records, and I know that Eno stopped being involved with EG, which meant it seems like Harold Budd wasn't involved with them either. And I kept looking for a couple of years and nothing came out. And I was still at that point going to physical record stores. This is still before the internet. This is the early 80s. And I would always look in the domestic area for Harold Budd, and there would only be the Pavilion of Dreams and Ambient 2, and that was it. I was still going through the import bins. And I went through the import bins with I can picture the exact store where I was in when I found it too. And I found this thing called Abandoned Cities, like dark cover and title, Abandoned Cities. Interesting to note, it's just the titles on the back here. And I thought, oh crap, I found the Harold Budd album. It's an import. They jacked up the price of it. I mentioned this in one of my other videos. Stuck an import sticker on, which is a bit disingenuous because the record label Cantil Records, which I believe was very short-lived. I think only 2 or 3 albums came out on Cantil Records, which was Harold Budd's label. He started his own label because he couldn't get his records released. I guess he wasn't signed so much to Eno's label, or Eno left his label, and Eno started a lot of labels too over the years, and then let them die out. So he didn't have a particular contract, but he decided to go put his own record label together. And I think I read there was maybe 3 releases on Cantil Records. I didn't know it at the time. I thought it was just a small record label. But it appeared that the record label was out of California because there's a California date, but Gem Records, which was are the people that distribute it, which was interesting to me. Gem Records was actually based here in New Jersey. Their primary function, though, was to release imports. So it was a big company for quite a few years, run by several brothers, I understand, who's primarily just imported records from all over Europe into the U.S. Huge warehouse here in New Jersey. Their operations were in Jersey, and a lot of rock music. I mean, it's the only way that Gong got into this country at all in the 70s. And they imported everything. A lot of the new wave groups before they had record deals. A lot of Tangerine Dream, all of the Klaus Schultz stuff that I bought initially on vinyl came from them. They distributed through the whole country, through the whole U.S., even West Coast. And initially, they were the only ways that a lot of these artists got heard or played around here. A lot of the early Tangerine Dream stuff, I know eventually, I guess, I don't know if it was once Virgin signed them so much, maybe the domestic stuff started coming through. But the pre-Virgin stuff of Tangerine Dream would have probably come through Virgin, Gem Records, as Edgar Froess's solo stuff as well. So Gem Records, oddly enough, on occasion, not very often, would actually distribute domestic albums. And not too often. At that time there weren't too many independent labels. But so it seems like Harold Budd started his own label briefly, this Cantil Records. Didn't really have distribution for it. Went to Gem Records, who was the importer, who said, yeah, we'll distribute your album, which was good because Gem Records could distribute it through the U.S. But I don't know if it was the record store taking advantage or whatever, or seeing Gem Records' name on the back, on the bottom here, that they stuck an import price tag on a record that came out of California and New Jersey. The record label's based in California. Gem Records was right in the same damn state that I bought the record in, and yet they charged an import fee for it, an import price, which was maybe $2 more than the domestic record. But I coughed up the money anyway. And especially when I saw, it was very interesting to me, only 2 songs on the album, 1 per side. The first track was something called Dark Star, no relation to the Grateful Dead song. And the second one is called Abandoned Cities, which is a 23-minute track, and Dark Star is a 20-minute track. Couldn't get it on home fast enough when I saw that. This is a really dark album. Most of you that would be familiar with Harold Budd probably have heard a lot of very pretty, spacious, ethereal albums by him, a lot of music, and that describes maybe even most of his music, I would say. Though in a lot of his music, if you listen closely, there is an undercurrent of darkness. It's not just pretty for pretty's sake, and you would never mistake a Harold Budd for a George Winston album. One of those guys, one of those piano players who plays pretty stuff. This is probably, I'm guessing, the least loved album, though, that Harold Budd ever put out. It's all dark. It's all very dark. I have it playing in the background, but the volume is low. And I'll tell you what it sounds like to me. There's also not a lot going on musically. And there's a small statement printed on the bottom of this, which for years I never even noticed and read, where it mentions installations. And I kind of came to the conclusion, even before seeing that note, which I didn't see for years actually, that it sounded a bit like installation music because it sounds like it's a loop. Both tracks, but especially Dark Star, which is my favorite. I love both tracks. Dark Star is my favorite. But it's the same, what you hear in the first minute and a half to 2 minutes is the same thing that you hear for the remainder of the piece, the rest of the 18 minutes of the piece. And Abandoned Cities, the 23-minute piece, sounds like it could also be the same, a loop piece. There's only a couple minutes worth of material, it sounds like. that's been repeated for the rest of the side. So for a lot of people, this wouldn't work, and probably doesn't work. But it's certainly my most played album by him. Certainly the darkest thing he ever did, especially Dark Star. And oddly enough, there's a credit here to Eugene Bowen, who plays a bit with Harold Budd on some early albums of his, credited with guitar. But it took me years to figure out where the guitar was, because the guitar is so processed and buried in the sound of the keyboard, the electronic keyboard on here, that I thought it was just a synthesizer playing single notes, but it turns out to be a guitar, which is really mixed down. It took me years to figure out where and if there was actually guitar on here. It's credited being the only other instrument on here besides Harold Budd playing electric keyboards, electric synthesizers, whatever. Even if I never listened to this again, ever, this would still, for the rest of my life, this would still be my most played Harold Budd album, because it's in a playlist that I listen to every night when I go to sleep, this album. Very laid back, very, very mellow, but dark. And a lot of people wouldn't like the fact that it's so repetitive. But especially the Dark Star piece, I have no problem listening to both pieces for over 20 minutes. I could go over another 10 minutes on each one. The Dark Star piece is, I think, a bit more noticeably repetitive, because there's only there's the line that the guitar plays underneath, which is just a couple lower notes on the guitar, and there's what sounds like kind of a chord being sustained by an electric keyboard, and then basically one chord change as Bud runs his finger kind of along the keyboard keys to change to like a second chord. But it's all kind of a blur, a beautiful blur. And when you first listen to it, if you don't pay close attention, or even if you do pay close attention, it doesn't sound like there's much going on. There's a keyboard holding out the keyboard notes, the sustained notes, and what turns out to be guitar, which most people, including myself, would easily think that it's another line being played on the keyboard. And that's it. But there's something positively psychedelic about the piece Dark Star in particular, which is my favorite on the album. And that is perception. This is one of those pieces that is abstract enough, because there's no rhythm or pulse or anything to it, that I swear that I hear other layers in there that may or may not be there. And I think of that every night when I play it, when I go to sleep, and I have that track playing. The second piece, The Abandoned Cities, I don't hear as many layers in, but I still very much like it. But Dark Star, I swear there may be other layers of keyboards there, but I also may be imagining it. And it's one of the few pieces that I've never gotten closer to really figuring out, and I probably never will, because I've listened to it thousands of times. And it's real interesting, and because of hearing damage, I tend not to put headphones on very much. But for those people that do listen to music with headphones, if you get a chance to hear this piece, and you do ever listen with headphones, I would say you don't have to crank it up real loud. But I think that perception of, I always think of this piece, Dark Star, as being an onion. There's layers in there. I think there's more layers than what I'm perceiving. I think there's more keyboards doing things further down in the mix that are combining into this overall thing. I never play the piece where I don't think that. I don't think that about it. And this, over the years, I have the original vinyl. It did come out on CD. Also came out on CD with an additional 19 minutes of music. That was a little EP that Harold Budd had put out that had shorter pieces that didn't not in this mode at all. Shorter keyboard pieces. And then recently, I think that CD may be out of print, but there's probably a lot of copies left around because that was in print for quite a number of years. So there is this album with an additional 19-minute EP attached at the end of it. And there was also a box set of Harold Budd works put out recently where this album was included in there. And just the two pieces, just the 43 minutes of Abandoned Cities with no extras on that particular disc. And I am going to also link a playlist on this video so you can hear it for yourself. And if there's a way to listen to it late at night with no interruptions, and particularly with headphones, see if you can peel back the layers of the onion that I think is there. I think there may be more going on there. And even though it's repetitively for 20 minutes, the Dark Star piece, the same thing, I still never come closer, even after listening for 15, 17, whatever, 20 minutes, to figuring out if there's other keyboard parts in there. But it's like an entire world onto itself, that one piece. And the 23-minute Abandoned Cities piece I love very much too. It's another unchanging piece that may also be a loop, because I don't really detect any changes after the first few minutes. But it's just one of those. That's a real piece to daydream to, the Abandoned Cities piece, which goes on for 23 minutes. I highly recommend it. I think maybe people that are into the Zeit by Tangerine Dream, it may be closer to something like that, or Irrlicht by Klaus Schulze. Maybe closer to that than anything by Harold Budd. Those may be closer comparisons, because you can't really. There's an occasional piece that sounds a little bit like it on Harold Budd. I can't find it right now. Here it is. If anybody's familiar with the lovely Thunder album by Harold Budd, which came out about 3 years later, in '86, this came out. This has a 20-minute piece on here, a 21-minute piece called Gypsy Violin. That's a little similar in taste. Not nearly as good, I think, as either one of the pieces on the Abandoned Cities album. But it's pretty much an unchanging thing that goes on for 20 minutes. But to me, can't hold a match to this. This is real, but it's dark. But easily one of my favorite albums ever. I might hesitate to call it an iconic album, but I guess it is. But I guess an iconic album, I kind of ended up making it or defining it as like the first album that I got by an artist that opened my eyes to them or something like that. And I was already into, two albums by Harold Budd before I got this. But yeah, I was so glad when this came out on CD, a little tired of wearing out my vinyl. But, and this was, it turns out, and I only found out a little bit of the history much later, that this was apparently Harold Budd's label, Cantil, which is long gone. And I want to say, somewhere I read a review or interview with one of the musicians that Harold had worked with. Excuse me while I go off camera. I dropped the record. I read an interview with one of the musicians Harold worked with that spoke a little bit about Cantil Records and how it was Budd's label apparently, and only survived as long as they could keep the money together for it, which was something like 3 releases. But the cover is really a good description of the music, kind of gray. And the titles, Dark Star, Abandoned Cities, gives you a little feel for the music. And I just thought I would talk about that. Definitely my most listened to album. And compositionally, it's probably his simplest album ever. There's probably less actual musical material on that album than anything else he's ever done. So, as a composer, I would not present that album to somebody. I would definitely the other album I showed though, the Pavilion of Dreams. This is a really good album to present to people, but as a composer, definitely a great musical album. But Harold Budd's also done a lot of compositional things and continues to. So I just thought I would talk about that today for lack of anything else. I'm going to be pulling out, like I said, a bunch of CDs, things that I've rarely listened to when I first got them, and give them some additional spins and talk about them. Things I mostly got in budget things, and I took chances, and they weren't things that I fell in love with immediately, so they didn't get a ton of plays. And now I'm going back into my archives, and I'm probably going to do some reviews of those things. And there's not going to be much thematically. The first batch that I grabbed was some fairly straight jazz stuff, some new age things mixed in there, not sticking to a particular genre even. And I have been slowly doing a little bit of my own musical work. Haven't gotten much done since I really made my last video, but I have recorded a tiny little bits here and there. And depending if I don't get a job for a couple months, I will. I'm going to attempt to have this finished and available, or at least finished by January 1st. I would like to make it available January 1st, but I am not going to put something out that's not complete just for the sake of a date. But I've got several pieces done, a couple of which I've sampled here. And I have a couple pieces, two pieces that I've sampled here that I put up on my page, including just like an introduction thing that's 90 seconds long, maybe. Two completed pieces, which aren't terribly long, and I have two more that I'm working on. One of them is very long. One of them is going to be, maybe 20-minute electronic synthesizer thing mostly, and then I've got a bunch of work. I've got some work done on it, but that's going all too slow. But I am gonna only give myself 2 months, but depending on how inspired I feel and if I can push myself a little bit, I'll be doing that, hopefully. And that's it. I never thought this video would go on for 43 minutes. I basically came here to talk about the one album, The Abandoned Cities, but I wanted to give a little bit of a lead-in to how I got into it. I want to say, by the way, thanks for indulging me and putting up with me for all the Halloween stuff, which is, you're gonna hear that every year from me, because I'm a Halloween nut. So every year when Halloween comes around, there's probably going to be a ton of things that you may or may not be interested in, ghost stories, that kind of thing. But thanks for indulging me with those. I'm going to try to do videos on a more regular basis once again, get back to that. And I'm looking forward to seeing all your videos out there, folks. And hope everything's going well. We'll be back soon. Take care.